Welcome for some more saber content. In my recent cold steel saber comparison series, I promised we'd take a look at a couple of windlass offerings, and yes, we'll compare them to at least one of the cold steels we looked at. But these classic windlass military sabers have been unflatteringly described as, well, kind of cosplay, reenactment only. They don't come sharp, but they do come with good steel that has a pretty good functional hardness, and supposedly they've been through proof testing. So after putting an edge on them and doing a couple of other things we're going to talk about, are they functional, and yes, how do they compare with the cold steels that tend to come to you more? Well, we talked about the term battle ready in the previous series as implying two things. Will it cut, and is it durable? Can I hit stuff with it without it breaking? And yes, we're going to put these through the tests and find out. So we're going to be taking a look at this 1850 foot officer's saber, not to be confused with a very similar 1850 staff field officer's saber that has a more elaborate guard. And you've seen this one before if you've been watching the channel, the one I've had the longest. Their 1860 light cavalry saber, this is what they call their officer's version, which has the decorative embellishments. Now when I did that initial review years ago, I struggled with two things specifically: how blade forward it was and how slim I felt that grip was. Now I managed to fix one and learn to live with the other one. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one first. Alright, starting with the Scabbard. Now this upgraded officer's model, instead of just a plain steel scabbard, it's got some brass embellishments to it. So it's got a brass shape, brass throat, it's got brass hangers that when you're wearing it the outside are kind of nicely engraved, and brass rings. Now in this particular version, which is a couple of years old, so I don't know if this is an example of what you would see now, there are no liners in here whatsoever, so that also means no retention. And yes, I stabilized the rattle of the rings. It's just kind of knocking around in there. So I have to be really careful to make sure that this material does not diminish my edge. But yes, I've had to resharpen it frequently because of that steel-on-steel contact. Now another thing I mentioned in the initial video on this one, and it hasn't repeated on any other products, but this one came to me packed in, I think it was some kind of cosmoline or something, because when I drew the blade, it just reeked of kerosene. And years later, it still does smell of kerosene. Not enough to make my eyes water, but it's still there. Now another thing to consider when it comes to a steel scabbard. Yes, you could potentially use it as a pairing device secondary weapon, but it does add weight to your carry. This one weighs 1 pound 8 ounces, or about 680 grams. So I wouldn't necessarily call it the weight of a whole other sword, but close. Close-up mode to talk about the friendly end. Now, as I mentioned in the initial review I did 3 years ago, that extra $50 for the officer's version over the plain version gets you embellishment on the pommel cap, the D-guard, the bars. There's nothing on the shell on the front side, but yes, you have embellishment on the inside of the guard. I added the blackening myself to make it pop. Now it is a peen construction that is very nicely smoothed over, and with years of hard use, nothing's come loose. That includes the smooth leather grip with the wire wrap over it, no hot spots, no spiky wire bits. The seam is on the front. I can barely feel it. How hard have I used this thing? Well, when you get to see the blade here in the next section, spoiler alert, the mirror finish that came from the factory is long gone. When I reprofiled it, I put a pretty coarse brush finish on it to hide all the nicks and dings I keep putting in it. Yeah, so it's been through it and it's held up just fine. Now, you'll notice there is no back strap on here. And I did have issues with that when it got a little excessive with the 1796. Go back to that video, which had a really wide, slick backstrap. The leather grip on the front wasn't doing it for me, wasn't enough to allow me to really feel like I had a good grip on the sword. However, there were some other things that made me feel like I didn't have a very good grip on this sword, at least initially. Now remember, initially it was, we'll talk about this in the blade here in a second, little bit too blade forward for me, combined with this really skinny grip. But first, okay, well, how much room do you have in your D-guard? Pretty generous 4 inches, 10 centimeters. So with my medium width hands, yeah, plenty of room. If I choke down, yeah, I got really stubby thumbs. Plenty of room for saber grip, or there's lots of other ways I can interface with the grip, and we'll talk about that in handling. But because the blade was so heavy feeling when I first got it, I felt that the grip was just too slim to control it. And I was wondering why. Compared to my cold steel sabers, and their grips are at least as thick as my Japanese style swords, or thicker. This reminded me, as I said in that initial video, more like a stiletto grip. Its widest point, it's less than an inch wide, about 15/16, so less than 2.5 centimeters. So yeah, pretty slow. Now, I had a number of commenters say the same thing. Well, you're supposed to be wearing gloves. It's like, well, aren't you supposed to be wearing gloves with those sabers that have thicker grips? Do Americans just have like tiny hands? Or they just like slim grips for some reason? And yeah, historic examples, they have slim grips. They got this right. Why? And thinking about it, I was wondering, okay, does it have something to do with the era? And officers, if they're not carrying a saber, might be carrying something that's more like a small sword or a spadroon or something like that, that does have a very slender grip. Maybe that's what they're used to. That's their comfort zone. So when they cross over to a saber, they just preferred something that was kind of similar. And the fact is, I've really learned how to work with it. We'll talk about that more in handling. But speaking of which, okay, so this is your classic French 3-bar guard design. Definitely biased towards the right side, but there is just enough of a shelf where I feel like my left thumb is not completely exposed. But if I use it ambidextrously, yeah, my whole back of my hand is exposed. It's designed to be worn on your left hip and sit flat for a right-handed swordsman. But that also might give you a weight bias to one side that you might feel in handling. We'll talk about that when we get to the handling section, but let's get to the blade. Let's talk about the business end, how it came to me and what I've done to it. Now, starting with the price, you can pick these up currently for about $250, which is about $50, $60 more than the unembellished 1860. And for that, we talked about the embellishments to the scabbard and the hilt, but also you get the etching on the blade on both sides. Now, it used to be a deep matte black, but that quickly started rubbing off. And now it's faded to kind of a gunmetal gray that I think looks, well, attractive. It's pretty well done. Steel. Cold Steel's been using a 1055. This is a 1075, so somewhat higher in carbon content, but similar Rockwell hardness, somewhere in the low 50s. Now, comparing it to the Cold Steel Napoleon I reviewed recently, some very similar specs. This is another 34-inch, 86.5 centimeter blade, and that's measured in a straight line from the guard to the tip. But it looks a lot slimmer front to back than the Napoleon. But measuring it, it really isn't. The Napoleon front to back was 3 centimeters. This is 2.8. It's only 2 millimeters difference. But I'm going to say, and this is a 3-year-old version, distal taper pretty disappointing. Spoiler alert, when we look at the newer 1850, much better distal taper from the factory. So this came to me with a distal taper of 6 millimeters to 4.5. Not much at all. And I felt it was balanced too far forward and, yeah, made it a little bit blade heavy for me. So what did I do to it? Well, came unsharpened. So not only putting an edge on the top 2/3, but also profiled it down to an apple seed so there's no secondary edge bevel. As I mentioned in the last section, I left it with a brush finish to hide the dings and scratches I keep putting in it. And yes, I've used this sword hard. I've accidentally collided with metal with the thing, and it's held up really well. False edge. Well, really not much there. Not only took it down to gave it an edge, but I took off enough metal that I decided not to go with a fully lenticular cross-section. It's almost a diamond, but that took 1.5 ounces off the sword, mostly up here at the foible. So what that did, it improved the distal taper from that 6 millimeters down to 3. And I'll show you distal flex here. It is now more towards the foible. And it took the weight down about 1.5 ounces to 2 pounds and about 1.5 ounces, so about 950 grams, not only in the historic range, but also in the range of the cold steel sabers we recently reviewed, that I do like that particular weight and point of balance. When it came to me, it was way out here at 8.5 inches. I brought that point of balance down to 6. For me, yeah, that's pretty perfect. But let's go ahead and see how it actually performs. Quick edge test. Not bad at all. No damage. Let's recap my test results. Now, I've tested this sword extensively over the years, so I wasn't totally surprised. There's the good and the things that still frustrate me. Starting with thrusting into first lapel, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper back paper up against my redwood target, and then to test penetration into harder media, straight into the redwood. Now, what am I testing? Well, penetration into the softer media. Yeah, that's an awesome penetrator and makes a nice channel into the media. Also had pretty good tip control for accuracy. Into the harder media, I'm seeing if the tip is durable, and yes, it absolutely is. Second thing I'm testing is flex in this case, so I specifically thrust with the blade horizontal, facing towards and away from the camera. And what you saw, yeah, was some flex, but not as much as I would expect considering how much steel I've taken off of it. Now, if I really threw my hand over the thrust, yes, you saw a lot more, but it's mostly, well, more springy than flexy and hasn't taken a set in any way, shape, or form, and then also includes with some of the other things we're going to talk about. But the third thing I'm testing is, okay, translation of that linear force back into my hand. Does my hand stay put? And the answer in this case is not very well. Now, if I'm in a handshake grip, it's not a problem. The worst thing that's going to happen is my hand is going to bump up against this flat guard. It's not uncomfortable at all. With my thumb on the back saber style, I could control it into the softer media, but going into that harder redwood target, yeah, I smashed my thumbnail. My hand's not quite staying put under impact. And that's going to come back to haunt us big time in just a second. But the next test, the bamboo test, I had no worries about inducing a chip or roll in this thing. It has hit much harder things than hard bamboo, including accidentally and maybe not so accidentally steel. And the worst that's happened is I put a little micro roll in it that was really easy to fix. So it's a surprisingly durable blade, even with the edge reduced. The other thing I'm testing, though, since I'm hitting that bamboo with about the same kind of force and rhythm I would when I'm fencing, is, well, is the sword nimble in that situation? And the answer is, for its weight and balance, it's actually pretty nimble and controllable. But then, cutting. I've done a lot of cutting with this sword. And I've mentioned in the previous videos, I don't do a lot of cutting unless I'm working on a sword and if I'm struggling with it. Both of those conditions apply here. Now, we've talked about my choice of media, but I need to bring up a couple of other things. The panel width I'm using and having it just sitting on the stand, that vise is not secured, is kind of the equivalent to a large water bottle. If I hit it wrong, it'll definitely let me know, including getting completely knocked off the stand. And what was happening was very specific. On more downward cuts at an angle, or even rising cuts, wasn't a big problem. But when I went straight horizontal, I'll mention that's not my best cut, but I was getting a consistent, not a big one, but there's definitely a scoop in it, and that scoop varied depending on which way I was going. So theory number one is, how much is the unbalance of that guard twisting the blade in my hand, especially when it meets resistance? I was doing it somewhat with the 1850, spoiler alert, not as much. That's a much more balanced guard on that sword. But it was also doing it with another sword I tested recently that I'll get back to in just a second. But I went ahead and tested the 1860 and the 1850 side by side. I was cutting for about an hour and a half just to try to get to the bottom of it. And what I realized was happening, it's the grip. It's not that it's too skinny, but it's really round and just slick enough that I feel like I need to add one more test to my test regimen that a couple of my sword reviewer friends already do, and that's the twist test. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the blade safely. No, it's not sharp down here, but I'm still going to pad my hand. Grip down on it. All right, and then try to see if you can twist it in your grip with a firm grip on it. And the answer is easily. It's almost like it's lubricated. So what's happening under impact, and after an hour and a half of white-knuckling both of those swords, I wound up with a blister from the friction because of how much they're trying to twist out of my hand. And no, I know some of you are already typing in the comments, a glove won't help me. A glove actually makes my grip sloppier. It's probably why you don't see a lot of people doing tamashigiri with gloves on. But the other sword I had a similar challenge with, got to go back to that cold steel 1796 with that big, wide, slick metal backstrap that I couldn't get a good grip on. It was trying to twist in my hand under impact. Now, this is not the result I'm feeling in martial handling. We'll get to that in a second, but I think my final recommendation is this might not be the sword for you if you're looking for something for backyard cutting. Alright, as for my martial handling experience, refer back to the Cold Steel Saber series. I've really come to appreciate what these Western style sabers can do for me, but there's certain things I also struggle with in terms of balance and other mechanics. And I'm going to judge these swords under a set of about 3 different criteria. Criteria number 1, we've already talked about the specs. Does it fit me? Now that I've modified it, I'm going to say yes. That's going to come back when we talk about the third thing. But the second thing, battle ready, it's basically asking 2 things. Will it cut, and is it durable? And it is definitely durable. Will it cut? Okay. Talked about the struggles with target cutting. It might not be your best choice, but you might have a different result from me. But when it comes to martial cutting, that rolls over into the third criteria. It's martial capacity. I feel like it's absolutely sufficient for martial cutting in, well, that sort of application where I'm not trying to cleave clean through a target. I'm just trying to do effective damage. And that's very similar to other slim-bladed, one-handed weapons. They're not cleavers, but are they good enough? But that gets us into our other Marshall criteria. For something this long, I'm judging its offensive and defensive capability. Do I feel confident protecting myself from an incoming attack with it? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I feel like I've got, well, the durability. I have just enough inertia in the blade that I feel like it could stop a variety of incoming attacks. I have some pretty good, but yes, lopsided hand protection. We'll get back to that in a second. And I can use the curvature of the blade to control in the bind to create some interesting gaps that I can put my business end in places that my opponent might have challenges with. Offensively, yes, I feel like it does have an effective enough cutting capacity. It's not the cleanest through a target, but I was definitely having good luck with other media and at other angles than that, well, challenging horizontal. So I feel like cutting, it's not as good as a more dedicated cutting sword, but good enough. And tip, okay, tip on target. That's a really nice tip in terms of penetration and channel. I feel like despite it being curved, I've got good control over it. And as we talked about in previous saber videos, I love the way the curvature gets that tip around corners, into gaps, into openings. And yes, having a sharpened back edge, false edge on it does allow me to do some back cutting. So yeah, I've got really good Marshall capacity with it there. With the weight and balance in, well, basically my sweet spot, I do feel like I can move with it very effectively and control it. Even in a power swing, I don't feel like I'm losing control of the weapon now like I was before I changed the weight and balance mechanics. So I really feel like I can use it not just as a saber, but as I've mentioned in previous videos in some of my cross training, where I'm doing some one-handed Japanese style swordsmanship with my saber and vice versa. You know, even being able to do some backsword with it, I can make that work for me as well. It is nimble enough. Now, the lopsidedness of the guard, I do feel it leaning over one way. It's giving me plenty of protection right-handed. For the back of my hand, it's barely enough for my thumb. But yeah, once I put it in my left hand, back of my hand's pretty much exposed, and it feels quite lopsided, which is one of the reasons why I decided to try the 1850. But we'll talk about that in the next video. Let's go ahead and cut this one off here. If you have this sword, any other windlass sabers, any other sabers by other makers, I'm really curious about, for instance, the LK Chen, or even what Cold Steel, well, they call it their 1860, it's really an 1840 heavy cavalry saber. But yeah, let me know what you think of those or any other recommendations. But until part 2, thank you all so much, as always, for watching, liking, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, adding to our conversation, and I hope to see you back for, well, we're going to get a little shorter and a little straighter.